Hi, I'm Eric Chessen, founder of Autism Fitness, and in this edition of Autism Fitness Concepts, I am going to discuss the SAID principle and how it relates to our developing of fitness programs for the autism and special needs population. Now, the SAID principle, that's S-A-I-D, stands for Specific Adaptation to Imposed Demands. A lot of technical stuff, so let's break it down. What that means, and we specifically talk about it in terms of exercise and the performance of physical activity. What it means is the body is going to habituate or respond to a stimulus. For example, if we have hurdle steps as one of our warm-up exercises, the athlete is going to perform it as many times as they need to in order to acquire this skill. And acquiring this skill is the process that we're talking about in relation to the SAID principle. The body is going to respond to the demands that we place on it. Now, even though we see this in gross motor functioning and movement patterning, where we see it play out the most is in strength and stability exercises, which tend to be the most challenging aspects of physical development for the autism and special needs population. This is where we see a lot of deficits, where we come into contact with some of the diagnoses like low tone or strength deficit, and this is something that I've seen historically with many, if not most, of my athletes on the autism spectrum. So it's certainly something that becomes readily apparent to anybody who's working with this population in a fitness, in a movement, in a therapeutic environment. So coming back to the idea of adaptation, number one is that we have to find the right progression, or more likely the appropriate regression for each athlete, because what we want to do is clear up the strength deficits, and we're not going to do that if the level of exercise is too challenging for that particular athlete. Now, the adaptation, the body's response to that exercise, in this case, when we're talking about a strength exercise, for example, a squat or a press or a band row, when that athlete performs that exercise X many amount of times, the body responds by getting stronger, developing stability, and eventually, and we'll get to this later, but eventually being able to generalize the skill to novel situations and environment. But first we have to look at what are the requirements, what are the needs for that athlete in mastering this particular exercise. That mastery is going to be absolutely dependent on the progression or regression of that exercise and how much contact that athlete has with performing that particular movement pattern. Now, when we're going into programming for each individual athlete, and this is something that is absolutely critical to developing a program that is actually going to work for each individual, we have to look at it from the perspective of how much contact, and we don't always know, but how much contact is this athlete going to need with this exercise before they are able to master it. And that's why in our autism fitness programming, we don't do, here's a 6-week chunk or an 8-week program or a 12-week program, because we don't know how long and how many repetitions, how much practice the athlete is going to need with that particular exercise in order to acquire those physical skills. So for some of my athletes in the past, it's taken them months or even a year, even 2 years to acquire the physical capability, that strength, that stability to independently master that exercise. So just because we have them perform it for 1 or 2 or even 20 sessions, it doesn't mean that the skill has been developed to a point where it is going to be meaningful for that athlete just yet. This is where the SAID principle comes into play big time. We have to look at how much stimulus, how many times the athlete has to perform that exercise before it's going to be something that is, again, meaningful for them, in as much as it's going to create the strength and stability that generalizes to life skills, so that that individual's quality of life is elevated. They're stronger, they're more stable, they're more independent, they're more motivated to do things for themselves, which is a separate category altogether. But generally speaking, when we are more able to be independent with our daily life activities, then we are more likely to take on those activities and have an impulse to engage in those activities as well. So the SAID principle, when we relate it back to the physical aspect of performance, the SAID principle is about creating a program, or in our programming, having enough exposure or practice with each exercise so that the athlete has control over the movement, can do it safely, effectively, with proper technique, so that eventually they develop the skill that is related to that particular exercise. This is where variety is not necessarily our friend. We do a lot of the same exercises over and over and over because we want the athlete to gain that particular skill. And if there's too much variety, they're not going to have enough practice with that exercise to gain the true benefit that it has to offer. Remember that an exercise is only as beneficial as it is performed, and as many times as it is performed. Now, within the context of a program itself, we're probably not going to have the athlete perform, let's say, a band row or a squat or an overhead sandbell press 100 or 200 or 300 times during a session, because it's going to become tedious, and also, and more importantly, the technique is going to start to break down, right? So the body's response to that is going to be fatigue. So we have to make sure that our programs are consistent and that the athlete is getting enough exposure to that movement pattern that they are going to be able to develop the skills around it to perform it better. So over time, we're going to see these increases in performance if we're staying with the same exercises for as long enough as it takes for the athlete to, again, acquire this skill. Now, where the progression and regression comes in is an athlete may not be able to perform that squat or overhead press or band row or farmer's walk with full baseline mastery in the beginning. So we have to simplify that exercise so that they can develop the technical skill to move on. We have to have prerequisites there. All right? So the SAID principle, again, specific adaptation to impose demands, means that the athlete needs enough practice with each movement pattern that they can move on to the next step. This is not necessarily time-based, this is really practice-based. So we want to be consistent with the exercises that we choose in our program. We want to be thoughtful in how we progress, or more importantly, regress each one of those exercises, and that is going to make a major difference in our programming for our athletes on the autism spectrum. I'm Eric Chessen, founder of Autism Fitness. If you want to learn more and join the movement for movement, head over to autismfitness.com. You can become an Autism Fitness certified pro, and you can join our monthly Autism Fitness Toolbox subscription that gives you access to the world's largest video library of athletes on the autism spectrum performing many and more of the exercises that I've spoken a little bit about in this video. I hope it clears up some confusion or some questions around programming for this population, but the SAID principle is a big one. Thanks for joining me.